But anyway, we'll get started. My name's Andy Nelson. I'm the chair of the Missoula County Democrats. And with our meetings moving forward, we thought it would be great to have a presenter series. So today, we have Rafe Graybill and Constance Van Kley here to talk about the Constitution. So I'm just going to read a quick bio real quick so you can get to know them. Constance Van Kley is the litigation director at Upper Stephen Law, Montana's first generationalist nonprofit law firm. Upper 7 holds the powerful accountable through litigation, focusing particularly on representing the disenfranchised, protecting and promoting democracy, and pursuing complex and novel constitutional claims. Constance has successfully litigated many cases of statewide importance. Her past and current work includes redistricting the Montana Public Service Commission, vindicating the state constitutional right to know, ensuring the prisoners are treated humanely, and fighting back against online extremism. She has represented clients in all levels of the state and federal court proceedings, including before the U.S. Supreme Court. Constance also teaches constitutional law at the University of Montana School of Law. Before joining Upper 7, she worked as the region's largest law firm and clerked both on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and for the Federal District Court Judge. Before law school, Constance became an RN and held various jobs including special ed paraprofessional, flight attendant, server, and stay-at-home mom. Constance lives in Missoula with her husband, a smoke jumper, and their 2 teenagers. Let's give it up for Constance. And next for Rafe Graybill, attorney at Graybill Law Firm and former chief legal counsel to Governor Bullock. And Constance Van, after serving as chief legal counsel to Governor of Montana, Rafe's notable courtroom wins for clients include winning a first-in-the-nation trial defending mail ballot voting against a suit by the President of the United States, including defending the trial judgment before the Ninth Circuit and U.S. Supreme Court. He also defeated the IRS and U.S. Department of the Treasury in suit challenging unlawful federal tax regulation, successfully emergency public health rule against challenge of tobacco industry, and protected Montana's leading conservation program in original proceeding for the Montana Supreme Court, which led to the protection of up to 200,000 acres of open spaces in Montana. Rafe has litigated appeals before the Montana Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court. Previously, Rafe trained as an attorney with the nation's leading trial litigation boutique and as a law clerk on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He lives in Helena with his wife and 2 daughters. Give it up for Rafe. And now I'll quit talking and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for coming. This is a really, really healthy turnout. And if folks in the back can't hear us super well, there's lots of seats up here. I think we have kind of a structure for how we want to do this talk, where we've each got some topics we want to cover. The first thing I want to say, though, is kind of inspired by how many people are here. I mean, you've got a delegate to the ConCon here, you've got members of the media, you've got an active legislator, and all of you, by being citizens, are active participants in our constitutional process. And I want to open, we're going to talk about how the Constitution might change and what that could mean. But I don't want anyone to think that the title of our talk, Constitution and the Crosshairs, means that engaging with the Constitution is bad, right? It shouldn't be this document that's stale, that no one touches, everyone's afraid of, that's sacrosanct. And the fact that you're here tonight, on a weeknight, when you could be anywhere in Missoula, Montana, but you're here talking about the Constitution, I think shows a really healthy civic culture and means you are part of that process. And even if you come out saying, you know, what we've had is pretty good, maybe we shouldn't change our Constitution in the ways that certain legislators, for example, want to change it, the fact that you came here, and we're going to make you talk a little bit and discussed it, is really healthy for our democracy and really is, I think, in the spirit of our Constitution. So, any introductory thoughts from you?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you. Thank you again for coming. I'm really excited about the turnout here.
So one thing we wanted to do before we get started is we really don't want this just to be a lecture, us to you. Again, in the spirit of the Constitution, all of our views matter equally That's sort of a baseline of our democracy. So before we start, we thought it would be great if we took just 2 or 3 minutes, turn to the person next to you, preferably maybe someone you didn't come with, and I want you to talk to your neighbor about why you came here tonight on this weeknight and what you want to get out of this talk, get out of this hour. So let's take 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and do that, then we're going to call on somebody. All right. We've also, I've learned, been joined by a special guest on the Zoom. Montana's Senior Senator John Tester is tuning into this talk as well, who is, we don't have a lot of former legislators as senators these days, and someone that's been on the front lines of dealing with the state constitution, being in the U.S. Senate, I think, makes our system better at the federal level. So excited to have him here as well.
Before Rafe and I get into kind of the more prepared remarks, we'd love to hear from a few of you about why you're here, what you talked about with your neighbor. So are there any volunteers to kind of share what you discussed?
So I care a great deal about 3 things. I care about the public trust doctrine, I care about privacy, and I care about a clean and healthful environment. There's a lot of other things I think that are great about our Constitution, but those 3 really speak to the issues I'm most concerned with.
Great. And you'll be pleased to know that a unanimous Montana Supreme Court said just 6 months ago, we have the strongest privacy protection in the United States of any state constitution. That's justices from every background agreed with that, and that's.
But it could be changed.
It could be changed.
Indigenous rights, gay and lesbian rights.
Maynann?
I'm most concerned about attempts to weaken the judiciary. The judiciary is what gives meaning to the Constitution. And there are 2 ways of changing the Constitution, amending it and changing the makeup and politicizing the Supreme Court and making the court not an equal independent branch of government. And I think that is probably the biggest threat to Montana right now.
Great.
Thank you for that. And I think we're going to talk about between Rafe and I kind of some of the specific proposals that are on the table in the 2023 legislative session, some bigger kind of theory and framing pieces. How we're going to start, though, is Rafe is going to give kind of an introduction into why we're here, why we think there's this level of engagement with the Montana Constitution, which is wonderful and heartening, but what are we responding to? So we'll start with kind of that place setting, and then I'm going to talk about constitutional change under the Montana Constitution more broadly, kind of the theory and framework pieces, and then kick it back to Rafe to go into the juicy bits about the 2023 legislative session.
And we won't, unfortunately, cover all 52 pending proposals to change the Constitution, but we'll certainly talk about a few. And again, we want to make sure this is a discussion as much as anything else. So if anyone wants to jump in, please do. Raise your hand, pipe in. I think that makes this for a healthy discussion. But kind of to frame where we're starting, I mean, 2 years ago, people outside really kind of elite legal circles weren't really talking about the Montana Constitution as kind of the preeminent political issue. That's changed, obviously. We've got a full room tonight. We've got a full legislature talking about this with more proposals than I think we've ever seen before to change the Constitution, at least since 1972. We changed the whole thing. And there's a couple reasons for that. I mean, one is simply the fact that in 1972, it's 51 years ago, we're on the 50th anniversary, and there was a big celebration last year, a series of talks. Maynann was deeply involved in that, and there was a real celebration of what our really forward-looking, citizen-oriented Constitution's done for our state. That was a good thing. The other big thing that's happened, I don't have to tell all of you, for the first time in decades, starting in 2021, there was no divided government in Montana. The natural process of two political parties taking a hard look at laws and having one party have a veto over a law wasn't there. And all these legislative proposals that have been kind of bouncing around as interesting ideas for a long time, interesting to some folks, less so to others, all of a sudden could become the law of the land. And you saw all this new innovation in the legislature, and as a result, a lot of people were affected by this, particularly in their personal, individual constitutional rights. And you saw, as a result, constitutional litigation flow from that. I was talking with Constance earlier today. There were probably more state and federal cases challenging Montana statutes in the last 2 years than in the entire 20 years before that. I mean, these questions come up occasionally. Usually someone's trying to get a permit. They throw in a constitutional claim, something like that. But what we saw in the last 2 years were cases that were really direct assaults on certain aspects of our Constitution. In many cases, for example, I represent Planned Parenthood in an omnibus case that challenges 4 restrictions on the right to access abortion care in Montana. Well, one of the things we talk about a lot in our case is that the legislature's own lawyers told the legislature in 2021, if you pass this, it will almost certainly be invalidated by a court. It's almost certainly unconstitutional. And they did it anyway. And there's a range of other examples like that where there are bills that clearly violate some of the Constitution's protections around voting rights, around the independence of the higher education system. Great innovation in our Constitution says the legislature probably shouldn't tinker with things that really the Student Council or the Board of Regents ought to be doing. Well, the legislature got into that domain as well. We even co-counseled on a case, Constance and I, that dealt with the rules by which bills become a law. We got some pretty good rules in Montana that were obscure until the last couple of years that said, you know, if you're going to pass a bill in the legislature, you got to tell the public what it's about. You got to be open and transparent. You got to have public participation, because ultimately the source of power is not the legislature, it's the people, right? And so you can't conceal from the people what's going to happen in a bill. Well, there was a bill that we challenged where 24 hours before the session got out, a group of legislators got together and in a totally partisan way rammed in 3 new ideas that had never been vetted, never saw a committee hearing, never saw a single public comment, passed the thing, passed out of both houses, and it became a law that governed your rights as citizens. Well, we challenged that, got that overturned because it violated this basic rule that the public needs to be involved, or at least be on notice, if you're going to change their rights in the legislature. So there's been this big shift in the last 2 years, and this talk comes at the beginning of a new legislative session that stands to potentially not only pass statutes that could implicate the Constitution, but actually pass proposals that we would then vote on about changing the Constitution itself that could potentially remove some of these protections that have so far stopped a really dramatic social and political change in our state from happening. So we'll talk about some of those at the end of today's talk, but before we do that, I want to kick it to Constance to give sort of a framework to think about what are good ways to change the Constitution, because that's a good thing, and what are bad ways to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this dovetails with the rest of my talk, but just one other thing that I think that we're seeing, one other reason for why we're seeing this increase in pressure on the Montana Constitution, why we're seeing more litigation, is that we're responding to things that are happening on the federal level too. And so one piece is that we're in a period of pretty rapid constitutional change on the federal level. From 2016 to 2020, during the Trump administration, we had pressure on constitutional norms unlike what we had seen in the past. And I think folks on the state level are responding to that. Some of them are true believers, and I think others maybe are seeing a roadmap for ways in which they can increase their own political power. And the other thing that's happening on the federal level is with a kind of a whiplash-inducing change in composition of the U.S. Supreme Court. we're seeing quick constitutional change that is in many ways curtailing individual rights that we have understood to be protected under the federal Constitution. And so litigants, aggrieved parties who are looking for protection are looking to state constitutions, not to create rights that didn't exist, but to protect rights that have always been protected under their state constitutions. So I think those things are playing out as well. What I'm going to give is kind of a general theory about the mechanisms about constitutional change. How do we know, what should we be on high alert for, and kind of a framework to look at the things that are happening, both in the legislative session and sort of generally in the Montana government. And I'd like to start with just kind of a quick recap about some differences with the federal Constitution. And the reason for that is that I think, with the exception of Mainan, probably most of us, all of us, including myself, are more familiar with the federal Constitution. We just know more about it than we do about the state Constitution. And so it gives a helpful comparison point. And the thing for purposes of this conversation to pay attention to is that the federal Constitution is incredibly difficult to amend. Since it was ratified, there have been something like 10,000 proposals to amend the United States Constitution. 27 of those have been successful, and 10 of them are in the original Bill of Rights in 1791. The last one in 1992 was actually proposed over 200 years ago in 1789, and that amendment provides that Congress, if it gives itself a pay raise, has to wait to actually get the money until the House of Representatives next convenes. Before that, it was the early 70s when Senator Mike Mansfield pushed for protecting the right of 18-year-olds to vote across the country. And because of that, because of how hard it is to amend the United States Constitution, there have to be some pressure release valves at the federal level. And so you need to have courts drawing analogies to what was happening at the time of the founding to what is happening now. You need to have some sort of level of responsiveness to the changes in society. And we've had a few times in the federal system when there's been really dramatic constitutional change. The Civil War, the New Deal era, the Civil Rights era, and I think we're probably in another period right now as well. And I think there's a lot to say about those different eras and how the current era of constitutional change potentially is different from them. But I think that's probably a talk for another time. So turning to the Montana Constitution, I'd like to propose that we think about constitutional change as falling under one of two categories. So there's what I think of as benign constitutional change, and that doesn't mean that it's value neutral in terms of the politics of it. So you might disagree with the politics of it. I would still call it a benign constitutional change if it is following the established mechanisms for constitutional change outlined in the Montana Constitution. So it's changing the Constitution. It's not attacking the Constitution itself. It is not attacking the constitutional order. And then, obviously, because I said we've got benign constitutional change, we have malignant constitutional change as well. And these are not necessarily straightforward proposals to amend the Constitution, but probably likelier to take another form. And these are ways in which the Constitution's meaning is being changed by office holders, but possibly in legislation, possibly by just sort of changing practices. And these are the malignant constitutional changes are the changes that are attacking the Constitution, attacking our system of government in a way that the Constitution itself doesn't have a response for. And the Constitution can't have a response for everything. It's premised on this assumption that office holders are not going to be exploiting the system for their personal gain. And that if they do, our democracy is going to be able to function in a way that they are held accountable and we're able to replace them with people who are good public stewards. So turning to those methods of benign constitutional change, the way that I think of them, we've got the citizens' initiative, we have the legislative referenda, and many of the proposals that we'll see are given the supermajority, the legislative supermajority, we will see an increase in legislative referenda, very likely. And then we have constitutional conventions. And I don't want to break down these different mechanisms too much. I just want to reinforce that these mechanisms of constitutional change were envisioned by the framers. They are part of the system. And it's why we don't have the same intense need for a pressure release valve that you have under the federal Constitution. We can trust the people. We can trust the people to change the Constitution themselves using these established mechanisms. And that's not to say that every legislative referendum or every initiative is necessarily strictly benign. I think that there are times when, particularly when voters are misinformed, where those processes themselves can be abused. However, these different mechanisms for amending the Constitution exist for a reason, and I don't think we should be so concerned about them as we should about that second category that I described of malignant constitutional changes. And when I'm talking about those changes, I think I see them as kind of falling under three general categories. But I think there are probably opportunities to think of more or to reorder these somewhat. And you have changes that are intended to attack democracy. You have changes that are intended to alter the balance of powers, because that is the framework that everything hangs from. And then you have changes that are intended to weaken civil institutions. So thinking about attacking democracy, what are some things that we have seen on the federal level, that we are seeing on the state level, that we can expect to continue to see on the state level? Unfounded attacks on election integrity, telling people that they can't trust the election process. Legislation or practices, administrative rules, or simply practices to restrict the right to vote, to limit participation in democracy. And I think also one thing we've seen very recently is questioning tribal members, whether or not tribal members should have an opportunity to participate in state government as well. Turning then also next to that second category of proposals that would alter the balance of powers, the investigations of the judiciary, I think are deeply concerning. The judiciary is the only nonpartisan branch of government by design, and it is the branch that is tasked with deciding the meaning of the Constitution by design. Similarly, we've seen the legislature, seen different legislators begin this practice of intentionally provoking the courts. I think what Rafe was talking about laws being passed knowing that they're unconstitutional, knowing that they're going to be challenged in court, knowing that they're going to be struck down as unconstitutional. That is using the courts, using the nonpartisan branch of government in order to, raise your political profile, increase your political power. We've also seen office holders refuse to follow court orders or threaten to refuse to follow court orders. And I think we've seen maybe less of this so far than I might expect, but I think we should also look out for the legislature intentionally provoking or attempting to curtail local jurisdictions' exercise of power. There's a very clear kind of roadmap under the last presidential administration with attacks on urban centers. And I'm concerned that we're going to see more of that at the state level as well. And then finally, that third category that I mentioned, that third category of malignant constitutional change is weakening institutions. And so, we have underfunding institutions so that people can't trust them anymore. They're not able to provide the services that they need. And so you blame the natural impulse is to blame the system for not working, when in fact it's potentially been purposefully underfunded. You have attacks on public servants, particularly teachers and librarians, attacks on experts, doctors, climate scientists, and finally, the last kind of issue that I've spotted under there is refusing to talk to the press or working selectively with press outlets that are determined to be favorable. All of these kinds of forms of, we don't think of these things as constitutional change the way you do when you see a ballot initiative that says, this is the new definition of privacy under the Constitution. But in fact, when these norms get broken, they don't just snap back, because what it does is it changes the balance of powers. And it's very unusual for an office holder to willingly give up power once they have it. And so I would just encourage everybody to think really broadly about the Constitution, to be as kind of fired up about the separation of powers, to be as fired up about the structure of government as we are about the specific, more policy-oriented proposals, because they're both incredibly important. But those structural changes are sneaky, and it's really hard to get back from them.
I mean, I take Constance's class any day. I think this is exactly right. And the solution, fortunately, is actually in the Constitution. It's democracy. It's holding elected officials accountable, not just when they formally propose changes that we may not agree with, but when they do these other forms of attacks on our constitutional order, like not follow court orders, like undermine belief in the rule of law. Just sort of anecdotally, I mean, Constance and I are involved in a lot of cases right now that deal with challenges that try to vindicate constitutional rights. And no one's ever said it to me, but I've gotten the sense more than once that you feel like you're litigating. Typically, you're in a case, and you want to win, and the other side wants to win. And that's kind of how the system is premised on that idea, and it works itself out. And you get in these weird situations in the last 2 years where there's a feeling that the other side doesn't believe in the system. They believe the courts are all rigged against them and it's a big liberal conspiracy. They don't expect to win. When they don't win because their arguments are wrong, they say it's just part of the conspiracy, and they go, and they have a grievance now that they can talk about. We're concerned about, this is another argument against the courts, is look what they did here. And that'd be a problem if Democrats did that. It's a problem now that Republicans are doing that, because that undermines the rule of law. And we're talking about, 20 cases right now, maybe 20 cases since the 2021 legislative session. Well, if you undermine the rule of law because you're mad about a couple of those 20 cases, what happens when you're fighting your neighbor over where your fence ought to go? Or fighting about water, good Montana tradition? Or you get hit by a bus? You don't want to have a system where people don't believe in the ability of courts to determine disputes. That's important beyond so many, far beyond the field of constitutional law. and politics. It matters to people's daily lives to access courts that can make legitimate decisions that we believe in. But there's a concerted political effort in this state to change those norms, break those norms down, because folks are mad about these 20 cases. So with that framing, I want to talk about, sort of using that framing, I want to talk about what's on deck in this session, what's going to come up, what we're going to see. And I actually think I want to start with that latter category of malignant constitutional change. Things that, don't come in sheep's clothing, they're disguised. There are other ways to attack our constitutional norms. Well, the first and most obvious, if you've been reading the news in the last couple of years, is the sustained attack on Montana's independent judiciary. Ann made a very good point earlier that all of our rights and freedoms in our Constitution that we care about are really just nice words on paper, unless you can vindicate those rights by going to court and you're getting an order that people believe in and will follow and see as legitimate. Well, in the last 2 years, there's been an effort to go after our courts. It began in the legislature in 2020. Well, predated that, but it really heated up 2 years ago when the legislature got unauthorized access to internal judicial emails, and there was a big fight, went to the Supreme Court. Well, that fight's not over. I think voters in 2022 sent a pretty clear message that they're interested in real issues in Montana, like our housing crisis, like access to child care. But the legislature, nonetheless, and its majority party, not Danny's fault, are continuing to put forward bills and proposals to put, I would say, really cynical, undue scrutiny on our courts. The premise of which is our courts are partisan, or the outcomes are rigged, things like that. So what's that look like in terms of bills? Well, you might see bills this session that try to limit when people get to go to court when they think their constitutional rights are at issue. So there's various proposals out there now that say, for example, you can't go and get a temporary restraining order if you're trying to get it against the government. Well, temporary restraining order is you go to court, and basically it's this really hard to get, really difficult, unique procedure where you say, something so bad is going to happen to my rights that I need protection from the court right now, or else something terrible will happen, and then we'll have a hearing later, and we'll go back and make sure we got it right. So you're talking about only the most extreme circumstances which require it. And the legislature is trying to say, well, you can do that unless you're suing the government. You don't get to sue the government and do that. Well, that goes against one of our basic constitutional values in Montana. I said earlier, our Constitution is premised on the idea that the people are the source of the power, and the Constitution exists to protect the people from the government and from government power. So how does the government get to say, we're going to stop you from coming into court only if you're suing us? You can sue, Joe Schmo. You take him to court, no problem. But if you're going to come after us, you have to experience that problem and come to court later, and we'll pick up the pieces. So that's one example of kind of going after norms and change. The example I'm probably most concerned about in this category is, as Constance mentioned, we have nonpartisan judges in Montana right now. And again, back to my examples, you want to fight with your neighbor about where your fence goes. You don't need a Democratic judge or a Republican judge. You need an impartial judge, an independent judge. Well, there are very real proposals out there right now in the 2021 or 2023 session to make it so that Montana has partisan judicial elections. And that is actually something that is not in the Constitution. That's something that they can change by statute. And that would present a real problem, because in every judicial election it becomes about should the Democrat win or the Republican win. We have enough problems with that system already in the two branches of government. It makes no sense to import those set of problems to the one branch that ought to be impartial. But that's a way you could change everything about our constitutional order in Montana with a statutory change. And if that bill comes up, hopefully it doesn't, everyone in this room should be concerned about it. Go there, testify, be part of your democracy, write to your legislator, even if they're going to vote against it, and show them, I don't care about those 20 cases. Maybe you do care about those 20 constitutional cases. I care about water. I care about abused children. I care about criminal victims of crime. I care about all these issues at our courts that we rely on them for, and keeping partisanship out of that system. And coming from a group of Democrats, organized as Democrats, that's especially powerful. So that's those are, and you're going to see other proposals around judicial ethics. Some of that's constitutional, but this sort of idea we're going to attack courts, we're going to make it harder to get to court, are all part of this sort of malignant effort to change our Constitution while calling it something else. Shifting, and we want to save time for discussion, shifting to sort of the constitutional change that announces itself as such. Briefly how that works. So there's a lot of concern about there's a supermajority of one party in the legislature for the first time in a long time. And that means several things, but one of the most important things it means is before the supermajority, if you want to change our Constitution, you typically have to go to the ballot and you have to organize a citizen initiative. And to do that is not impossible, but it's relatively hard. You have to get a lot of signatures, you have to go through a lot of hoops, you have to get the language approved, do all this stuff. And it's basically a safety mechanism so that any old schmo can't say, why don't we get rid of taxes? And just put that on the ballot. You have to really go through a process, and it gets vetted in an appropriate way, and you show some baseline support, and then you get to present your idea. It's a pretty good balance. Not as restrictive as the federal Constitution, but nonetheless, there's some safety there. The other way is you get 2/3 of legislators to refer a question to the ballot. And in a world with traditional divided government, getting 2/3 of legislators to agree on anything other than, anything really, is a tall order, and so you typically don't see a lot of those get passed. Well, with 2/3 belonging to one party, all of a sudden all those priorities that were held back by the Constitution before are a little bit more in reach. You can't change the Constitution outright, but you can put all these questions. Should we ban abortion? Should we get rid of our right to a clean and healthful environment for some reason? You can put all those questions onto the ballot and let the voters decide. And the voters decide on a majority basis. It's not 2/3 then, it's majority, or 50% plus one. So what are those proposals? I mentioned there are, I think the last time I checked a week ago, was 52. It's probably more now bouncing around. But the proposals, not surprisingly, mostly respond to court cases where the legislature was told, hey, you got to read the Constitution. You can't do that thing you're trying to do. So what are those proposals? Well, one that I think is particularly relevant in this town, there's a proposal that would say the Board of Regents, which right now is independent, has to do what the legislature says. Basically totally collapses the independence of the higher ed system. And that would have a dramatic effect on our state. Then the legislature gets to be student council, gets to do what they did last time. You had bills deciding who could be on what sports team, which clubs got funding. And I'm putting this in pretty generic terms. And these were bills that were targeted towards trans individuals, bills that were targeted towards pretty thoughtful anti-discrimination policies our universities had in this state. Legislature wants to make those decisions. They can't do it now, but you may see a proposal to do that. There are proposals out there to go after the right to a clean and healthy environment. Personally, I think if you put that on the ballot and say, dear voters, do you want a healthy environment or not? It's pretty tough to win that campaign if you're trying to change it. But there are lots of more clever ways to do that, to put little words here, words there, take things out. So I'd look out for that. That hasn't quite coalesced yet. The governing party in the legislature has a big, sort of moving to another topic, has kind of a big debate on its hands about what to do about abortion in Montana. Under Montana's right to privacy, we have the strongest protections for privacy in the country. Our Supreme Court has held this extends to a decision that women make about their body, about whether to continue a pregnancy to term or not. And so we have a very strong protection for abortion care in this state. Really, you can't pass a statute that bans it, and the legislature knows that by now. They've been overturned so many times and will continue to be overturned. So they've got this big debate to have. Are they going to put on the ballot a question that says the right to privacy excludes the right to receive an abortion from a provider of your choice? Or are they going to do something else? Say no government money can go to abortion care, or the government may make reasonable restrictions on abortion, or something in the middle. And I think this presents a real challenge for the governing party right now because, as you all probably saw in 2022, there was this so-called Born Alive initiative that in a very conservative year with a very conservative electorate didn't succeed. There was a Supreme Court race that they tried to make partisan and tried to make about abortion in some sense. And that effort did not succeed. So there's going to be a debate. I don't think we have an answer yet about whether they're going to kind of go for the whole 9 yards and try to amend the Constitution fully, or pass laws they know will get overturned again, create more work for lawyers, or do something in the middle. And I sort of think something in the middle seems like maybe how they'll go if they're being strategic. A couple of areas, too, that kind of go towards this malignant change as well. I think you're going to see proposals that affect sort of the democratic process in our state as well. Montana has a really good independent redistricting commission, where it's not just the legislature picking its own districts, it's an independent group of folks doing that. There's been a move across this country to try to get rid of those and give it back to politicians to choose their own districts. To change that in Montana, you'd have to change the Constitution. I think you will see proposals to do that. I think you'll see proposals to elect Supreme Court justices by district. This is an idea that's been kind of bandied about forever. The idea being maybe you would favor one ideology over another if you had the Butte Justice and the Great Falls Justice. Now the problem with that, obviously, is you're fighting with your neighbor about your fence. You're only going to get to vote for the Missoula Justice, but the Great Falls Justice is going to rule on your case. It's an obvious problem if they're going to change your rights. And so that's something to watch out for, especially proposals where folks think that tweaking the rules in a neutral way helps them. That's always something to watch out for. And then, there are other, I guess the last thing I would say, there's some other sort of category of constitutional changes that may not actually do anything, but may feel good to put on the ballot if you're the legislature. So we were talking about there's a proposal now to amend Article 2, Section 3 of our Constitution. That's the inalienable rights section. So it's the right to seek life's necessities in lawful and healthful ways and have a clean and healthful environment. And it also includes the right to possess and acquire property. Well, somebody in the legislature wants to put the word possess, use, and acquire property and have that be a big change you all vote on. Now, I haven't talked to this legislator. I don't know what they think they're doing with that. But I read that and I say, well, acquire and possess seem a lot like use. I'm not really sure what we're changing there. But that's an example of something you might see. Someone might think, well, there's an angle there to try to get more than we're getting now. And I think those kinds of constitutional changes are also something we should be suspicious of or really look at closely because, constitutional change isn't bad on its own. It's actually a good thing on its own. But it should be really clear what you're doing. The voters should really know what you're voting on and know what problem you're solving. And I think a good question to ask, and I'll kick it over to Constance in a second here, with any of these proposals, or others that may come up in the next 80-some days in the legislature, a good question to ask is what problem specifically is this solving? Now, for some, it's pretty obvious. The thing to get rid of abortion from the privacy rights, okay, we know what problem that legislator thinks that is solving. They think it's solving the problem of abortion access. But these more murky ones, like justices by district, or give legislators the right to pick their own districts again, I think the public discussion should begin with, well, what are you trying to do here? And why is it a problem now? And if you can meet that burden as a proponent, then great. Maybe we'll support it. But if you can't meet it, or it's not clear what you're doing or why you're doing it, then I think we as a society should give that a real hard look and think about whether that's worth supporting. I'll end on this note, and before I kick into Constance. There is a feature in Montana, I think historically, that when you give any of you ever voted in like Washington State or California before? Okay, those ballots are like 10 pages long. They're full of, you vote for every judge that's ever been thought of. You vote for all these ballot questions. Montana, we have those nice 2, maybe 3-page ballots, right? And Montana, historically, because we have this great libertarian streak, if you present a lot of questions to Montana voters, they often say no to everything. 2014, there were 2 different proposals to restrict voting rights, including getting rid of same-day voter registration. Montanans said, I don't like any of that. Well, why are you trying to make all these changes? And I do think one risk that the legislature could run into is if they kind of go wild and put 10 questions on the ballot about changing the Constitution, they may find out how the people feel about that. I think the answer may be no. It's pretty easy to say a straight no vote on these changes than to say, well, I'm going to vote yes on this one, no on that one. And again, that gets back to that fundamental question. What problem are you solving with this proposal? Can you answer that question? Constance, other things I'm not tracking.
No, I think we should open it up for questions.
So what are you all hearing about the Constitution? What are you concerned about? What do you see out there? What should we do about it? Pete.
It's sort of related to this. One thing that Constance mentioned that I hadn't thought about before was a constitutional convention. Is there any concern in that area at all? It's been 50 years since the last one. Could it come up in discussion?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and then we may have different views on this. There was a little talk about this before the 2022 election, some kind of whispers I'd heard about this. You have a real dog catching up with the car problem, I think, if you do that. That is to say, if your grievances are with a few portions of the Constitution and you want to amend the whole thing, you get together, you got to figure out the whole thing too. And it's just ripe with opportunities to get it wrong when we've got a pretty good, pretty predictable balance now. So I guess I'm not in the minds of legislators as to that specific question, and folks here may know more who are in the legislature about whether that's come up. But I think a lot of people with specific grievances would probably prefer the amendment by amendment approach because you destabilize everything otherwise.
Yeah, I will add just a little piece to that too, and that's that I think if what you want is control over the Constitution, you are looking at changing specific provisions, but even more than that, you're looking at changing the judiciary. I think if what you want is to make sure that your policy goals can go through unchecked, the most efficient and really sinister way to do that is to put people in the position of reviewing your policy choices who you know are going to rubber stamp everything that you do. The Constitutional Convention, even if it's referred by the legislature, the people have 3 chances to weigh in. So the legislature refers it to the people to vote on whether to call a constitutional convention. Then the people vote on delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and then the people vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So the Constitutional Convention, I think it seems really kind of broad and scary in theory, but in practice, I think it's very unlikely that it could. I think it's unlikely that anybody's going to try to co-opt that process for personal political gain, and I don't think it's actually probably a corruptible process.
And for those who don't know, Maynard Ellingson is a former delegate to the Constitutional Convention, so she probably has some insight on this.
Be noted that the Constitution does provide an opportunity every 20 years for voters to decide whether they wish to hold a constitutional convention. The next vote will be in 2030. There was a vote in 1990 in which the majority, an overwhelming majority, said no. They did not wish to call another constitutional convention. And then again in 2010, there was another election. It was still a fairly overwhelming vote against calling for a convention, but it was a smaller minority, or a smaller majority. So it had seemed that there may be less satisfaction in 2010 than there had been in 1990. I think there's some recent polling done in the last election, which really showed that most Montanans still very strongly appreciate and support their Constitution. And I think most people will realize, since they're going to have a vote on it anyway in 2030, it would not make a lot of sense to propose an earlier vote.
And I think a point on top of that, and I said this at the outset, I don't think either Constance or I are of the view that you have to love everything in the Constitution or that you have to oppose all changes. I think by being in a pluralistic democratic society, we're all, there's parts of the Constitution I wish had greater emphasis in our courts. There's parts I wish were in it. I do a lot of union side labor law. Not a lot about labor law in the Constitution, for example. But the key is to do it through these benign structures as described by Constance, where you follow the rules and it's an orderly process and it's a process you believe in. And I think where we really get off the rails is when folks say, well, we don't know if we can win on the merits. We don't know if we can win outright, so let's go through these other procedures like picking our judges or making it harder to get to court that kind of cut corners. And that's why it's called malignant. Sir?
Is there any possibility of restoring the bipartisan Judicial Selection Commission?
I think legally it's possible because
Practically.
No. Do you disagree?
No, I agree. Yeah, unfortunately.
I understand.
I'll wait for the mic if you could.
I understand that the legislature has within legislative services, presumably lawyers who review laws for constitutionality, and their assessment, I believe, is public. Is there any attempt to change who those lawyers are and what their orientation might be?
I'm talking too much, but I do have a thought on that. They're not public anymore. That's been a change. It used to be that the legislature's lawyer, they do have lawyers in the legislature. They review a subset of the bills for their substance. I mean, they write the bills to begin with, but they don't review them all for whether they're constitutional. And it used to be, so any bill right now, you go to the legislature's website, leg.mt.gov. You can click on a link that shows you the fiscal impact, what it's going to cost. It used to be you could also click on a link that if a lawyer had looked at it and had said, I don't think there are any issues here, or maybe some issues here, you could see that. The legislature changed its rules 2 sessions ago to say you can FOIA those, but you don't get to know those. So in the case I mentioned, where the legislature's lawyer said, don't do this, we had to subpoena those from the legislature to get them. Again, that's probably another form of malignant constitutional change, is denying the public the easy way to know what its lawyers think. The other thing about those lawyers, I worked at the state, I worked with those lawyers quite a bit. They're in a pretty tough spot because they've got a client. They got a boss, and they've got a client that really wants to do something, and maybe, it's what your client wants to do. It can be hard for some lawyers and some setups to give them bad news. And there's a real bad news problem, I think, with saying, hey, by the way, this idea you have is really problematic. To me, that when I see one of those, they call a legal note, it means that in spite of all the incentives to say nothing, the lawyer thought it was so bad that they put a note in there. And the notes are always they're not like this is a problem. They say, well, this might raise questions, and a court could come out either way, but that's code for, oh, wow, this is a 5-alarm fire. You got to really watch out for this. But that's the dynamic, and it's not necessarily their fault, but it's, they're their bosses, so it's hard to give bad news sometimes.
One more question.
You take this one, sorry.
Well, we'll see what it is. Yeah, that was a good response. I'm not feeling grabby.
The legislature comes up with a whole pile of potentially obnoxious attempted amendments. So that has to go on a ballot. Do they have to wait until 2024, or could they somehow put up an election even sooner to try to get that stuff through?
I believe it's the next general federal election is when I don't think you can do a special election for it. Because, for example, it doesn't occur in the federal primary. So I think you have to wait till the federal general.
I think that that's right too. I don't know for sure.
But some change, like I mentioned, the make judges partisan, those that could take effect immediately because that's a statute. And so you might have, get rid of the Supreme Court ballot issue. Well, not really that, but you might have a ballot issue that's a constitutional change that's pretty dramatic, but it hasn't taken effect yet. But you're going to have like partisan voting on judges when that occurs. So that could be a real challenge. And again, that's why you've got to really look out for these changes that are presented as statutory changes, but really go after the norms of a separation of powers in independent courts.
Could I exercise the guy with the mic privilege and quick two-parter? The 50 plus 1 for the vote, the people's vote, to approve an amendment, is that a low threshold, comparatively speaking? Is that, compared to other states? Is that...
It's pretty common compared to other states. It's definitely, there's no state that I'm aware of. Maybe there are some where there's a kind of a more bare majority. I'm not sure. It's on the low end. A lot of states have constitutions that are harder to amend. In our system, the hurdles are kind of on the front end. It's getting it on the ballot, but it's not unusually low for sure.
Well, it's consistent with the margin by which the Constitution was approved in the first place. So I think it's totally consistent.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Part 2, your Vegas bookmakers, what are the chances of an amendment being approved, legislative proposed amendment going through this session? Or next?
You mean reaching the ballot or being approved once on the ballot?
Reaching the ballot.
I think it's a 100% chance you'll have ballot questions. In the last session there wasn't a supermajority and we still had ballot. I guess we had statutory ballot questions, but right? Don't you think, or am I wrong on that?
We had one that came within, I think, 2 votes of becoming a constitutional ballot initiative. That was to add the right to hunt and trap to the Constitution. So I think that's going to be run again. There's a good chance it'll.
Okay, that was too easy then. Reach the ballot and approve.
I think it depends entirely on what the substance is, and I think if they put a ban abortion amendment, I think that's probably going to lose. I think if they put 10 amendments on the ballot, I think there's a good chance they all lose. But somewhere in the middle, if it's right to hunt and fish, that'll probably win. And trap.
Yeah.
That'll probably, I think that would, I don't know.
With that information, I'd put the odds at 80-20 probably. But before that, I think there are just too many variables to know for sure. So I was going to go 50-50.
And the good news is, I don't know how to bring this analogy over for the Vegas book, but we all decide, right? And so there should be, this discussion now in the early, first week of the session, we don't know who's fighting about what yet in the session, really. We get to decide, right? We're having this early discussion now, and we should, as a society, not just Democrats, continue to talk about these changes and inform the legislature that we, the people, hold the ultimate power under our Constitution and will have a say. And make sure to reach out to our friends and neighbors who maybe aren't as politically engaged and have that conversation with them, because they get to vote too.
Can you take one question about the Montana Democratic Party?
Maybe.
As I listened tonight, over and over, we're being advised, stay alert and watch out for this, look into that. And it sounds like Patrick Henry's observation that the price, if I can paraphrase Patrick Henry, the price of keeping our Montana Constitution intact and strong is eternal vigilance. And that to me means not just experts like you in the legalities, but regular citizens. And I wonder if the amount of engagement by Montana Democrats is adequate to protect the Constitution and to prevent some of these kinds of attempts to limit rights. Are we doing enough, and what can we do to galvanize more people?
We go first?
He has to answer.
You should have said, you should attend Central Committee meetings.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the things that that we've been talking about that are most concerning, I think, really are they are not partisan issues on the level of the citizen. They're being used as partisan issues by office holders in order to entrench and increase power. But what we need is a more informed voting public at large. We need more engagement at large, and we need office holders who are going to provide information fairly and freely to the voting public.
And I'd say we're not there yet, but we're on our way. I mean, I first visited a Missoula Central Committee meeting as a partisan candidate for Attorney General in a primary, probably 3.5, maybe 4 years ago. And there were probably 1/4 the number of people at that meeting that are at this meeting. The Democrats have done quite poorly in elections since then, and yet there are more people here than back in the good old days when we thought we could win all these elections. That to me says there is a real interest in our Constitution, and I think this is the starting point. And I think the next steps are, certainly making sure other folks who are already engaged in politics are paying attention and are being vigilant. But the sort of harder next step is what I said, reaching out to people who maybe aren't as engaged in politics for a good reason. They have other stuff to do in their lives. Not everyone should have to be into politics all the time. But at an appropriate time, that person in your life or those people in your life who are interested in your views, letting them know this is something to watch. This is something that's really important, and we're at a big moment in our state.
Thank
you. If I may, circling back to how we started and what you just said. Okay, a little closer. A quote. "The glory of justice and the majesty of law are created not just by the Constitution, nor by the courts, nor by the officers of the law, nor by lawyers, but by the men and women who constitute our society, you and me, who are the protectors of the law as they are themselves protected by the law." Robert F. Kennedy. Amen. Here, here.
On that note.
I think we're safe to close with RFK. So.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? Rafe, Constance?
No, I just continue to be really heartened by the turnout and the really thoughtful engagement. I'm excited by everybody's excitement in the Montana Constitution and concern about where things are going. I think that this is the necessary kind of first step to protecting our democracy.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Just a reminder, we'll be starting our Central Committee meeting in 2 minutes.